An arrogant cop arrests a black woman, believing he holds all the power, but seconds later he realizes she is the chief federal prosecutor, and his world starts to crumble. Before we dive into this powerful story of justice, let us know where you're watching from. And if you believe in exposing the truth and holding the powerful accountable, hit that subscribe button together. We can make sure this story reaches the world and sparks real change. Now sit back and witness the story unfold. The blaring sirens shattered the peaceful silence inside the car. Danielle instinctively glanced at the rearview mirror, catching the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the pavement behind her. A police car was tailing her closely, its signals making it clear she was being pulled over. She frowned but didn't immediately feel fear or panic. She knew she hadn't broken any traffic laws. Her speed was well within the limit. She had used her turn signals properly, and everything she did was by the book. Getting pulled over wasn't a new experience for black people in America, especially for someone like her, a powerful and accomplished black woman. She had heard too many stories of unwarranted traffic stops, of random checks with no justifiable cause, and she understood that this could very well be one of them. Keeping her composure, Danielle slowly pulled over to the side of the road, placing both hands neatly on the steering wheel, an ingrained habit of self-preservation. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that no matter what happened, she had to remain calm. One wrong move, one misstep in her reaction, could escalate the situation far beyond her control. The police car's door swung open, and a tall figure stepped out. Dark uniform, a belt weighed down with gear, polished leather shoes striking the pavement with crisp, deliberate steps. Officer Tyler, a white officer with an air of entitlement, strode toward her car with an unmistakable sense of authority. No greeting, no introduction. He loomed over her window, looking down at her as if she were a criminal. He didn't bother knocking on the glass or asking for her documents first. Instead, his first words came as a sharp, impatient order. "Step out of the car, now." Danielle raised an eyebrow, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "No license and registration, please." "No. Do you know why I pulled you over?" Just an immediate, aggressive command. She had handled many cases of police misconduct before, and Tyler's behavior fit the profile of officers she had prosecuted to perfection. But instead of complying right away, Danielle kept her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Tyler crossed his arms, irritation flashing across his face at her refusal to obey without question. He didn't offer a reason, didn't show any intention of explaining. He simply looked at her with that same condescending, judgmental glare, as if she had no right to ask. "I said step out of the car, now." His voice was harsher this time, carrying the weight of someone who wasn't used to being challenged. Danielle kept her hands firmly on the wheel, studying him carefully. She knew that outright defiance could escalate the situation, but at the same time, she couldn't allow herself to be treated as someone beneath him. "I haven't violated any traffic laws. If you have a legitimate reason for asking me to step out, I'd like to hear it before complying." A beat of silence passed, but instead of responding, Tyler abruptly pulled a flashlight from his belt and shined it directly into her face, aggressive, blinding. The harsh light made her blink rapidly, but she refused to back down. "You think you know the law, huh?" He smirked, his voice dripping with mockery. "Step out of the car right now, or I'll make you." This time, it wasn't just an order, it was a threat. Danielle could feel the tension thickening, could sense the eyes of passing drivers watching the scene unfold. She knew exactly what kind of man she was dealing with, a bully in uniform, someone who expected obedience without question. But what he didn't know was this. She wasn't someone who bowed easily. This was only the beginning, and Tyler had just made the biggest mistake of his career. Tyler stood up straight, his expression tightening in frustration as he watched Danielle refuse to immediately comply. He was used to giving orders, and when he gave them, he expected absolute obedience. He didn't like being challenged, and he especially didn't like a black woman standing before him, boldly demanding a reasonable explanation. A wave of irritation swelled in his chest. Without hesitation, he suddenly reached out and yanked the car door open with brutal force, the door swinging so violently it nearly slammed into Danielle's leg. Before she could react, a rough hand lunged inside, clamping down on her arm. The sheer force of his grip sent her lurching forward, throwing her off balance. "Get out! Now!" he growled, dragging her from the driver's seat as if she were a dangerous criminal. Danielle clenched her teeth, a sharp pain shooting from her wrist to her shoulder as she was forcibly pulled from the car. She had never intended to resist, but the way he was handling her now, it was deliberate. He wanted to dominate her. For a brief moment, the air outside seemed to still. Bystanders stood a few feet away, eyes widening at the scene unfolding before them. Some stopped in their tracks, a few raised their phones to record, but no one stepped forward. No one intervened. Tyler didn't care about the eyes watching him. He wasn't worried about being filmed. He knew that in situations like this, most people would just record and then walk away. And if anyone dared to question his actions, he had more than enough ways to justify them. A smirk tugged at his lips as he reached down to his belt, pulling out a pair of cold, metallic handcuffs. No warning, no explanation. He seized Danielle's wrist and wrenched it behind her back. She inhaled sharply as the steel clamped around her skin, cold, rigid, unyielding. The cuffs locked into place with a sharp click. It had all happened so fast. One moment, she was just a woman driving home after a long day at work. The next, she was standing in the middle of a crowded street, wrists bound behind her back like a criminal caught in the act. Her chest rose and fell with steady breaths, but she made sure her face remained completely unreadable. She would not give Tyler the satisfaction of seeing a single flicker of fear in her eyes. Tyler, however, was different. He wanted to see it. His gaze lingered on her, his expression smug as he relished the sight of her in cuffs, surrounded by onlookers. "So tell me," he leaned in, voice dripping with mockery, "does anyone here look like they care about your precious laws now?" Danielle's hands curled into fists. She could feel their stares, some filled with pity, some with curiosity, but most with indifference. To them, this scene was nothing more than a routine part of life. Tyler chuckled under his breath, his voice low and sharp as a blade. "You really thought you could lecture me about the law? You're just another nuisance." Heat surged through Danielle's veins, not from fear, from fury. He thought he had won. He thought he had control. But what he didn't realize, what he couldn't possibly know, was that in this very moment, he had just walked straight into a nightmare of his own making. Tyler was used to wielding his power to intimidate those he saw as weak. But this time, he had no idea he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. What happens when Danielle isn't just another silent victim, but someone who can turn the tables? When the truth comes to light, who will really be in control of this showdown? The police car door swung open, the lingering heat from the engine rising off the pavement. Tyler wasted no time. He grabbed Danielle's arm roughly, shoving her toward the patrol car parked at the edge of the road. Even though her wrists were already cuffed behind her back, he didn't ease his grip. If anything, he tightened it, his fingers digging into her elbow as if she were some dangerous criminal that needed to be subdued. His hand was cold and calloused, his grip bruising. She could feel the pressure sinking through the fabric of her coat, pressing into her skin hard enough that she knew bruises were already forming. But Danielle didn't resist. She knew that in situations like this, even the smallest movement could be twisted into resisting arrest, a charge she had seen far too many times in case files before. Every forced step, every crushing squeeze on her arm, this wasn't just an arrest. It was a show of dominance, and Tyler was reveling in it. When they reached the open car door, he suddenly yanked her arm back with a sharp jerk, throwing her off balance. Her footing faltered, her legs momentarily unsteady. But before she could regain her stability, a hard shove from behind sent her crashing into the back seat of the squad car. Her knees slammed against the edge of the seat, pain spiking instantly. Her back hit the hard surface, and with her hands still cuffed behind her, she couldn't brace herself, couldn't adjust her position. The awkward angle twisted her arms uncomfortably, making every breath feel more constricted. Outside, Tyler straightened up, looking down at her with satisfaction. In that moment, he wasn't just a cop making an arrest, he was a man who believed he held absolute power. Leaning forward, he rested an arm on the roof of the car, peering into the open window. His voice was slow, deliberate, dripping with mockery. "You think you're so smart, don't you? Danielle didn't respond. She didn't need to dignify his taunts with words, but her eyes steady, unyielding, locked onto his, refusing to waver. Tyler scoffed, letting out a quiet, derisive chuckle. But it wasn't enough for him. As if needing to savor his moment of triumph further, he pulled his personal phone from his pocket and dialed a number. Danielle heard the soft beep of the call connecting. Then his voice came through low, gloating, dripping with amusement. "Got a big one this time." A pause, as if he was letting the moment sink in, relishing it, then a quiet, chilling laugh. "Let's see how cooperative she really is." Danielle kept her gaze fixed on the city lights outside the window. He thought this was his game. He had no idea. Right in this moment, he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. The inside of the police car was cold and stifling. The low hum of the engine vibrated beneath the metal floor, blending with the steady rhythm of the tires rolling over the pavement. Danielle sat in the back seat, her back pressed against the stiff leather, her wrists still bound tightly behind her. The metal handcuffs dug into her skin, leaving raw, burning indentations that deepened with every jolt of the uneven road. Outside the window, streetlights flickered past, casting long, distorted shadows across her face. Her expression remained composed, but her eyes sharp, unyielding, took in everything, remembered everything. Up front, Tyler sat comfortably behind the wheel, one hand gripping the steering wheel, the other resting lazily on the car door. His posture was relaxed, casual, like this was just another routine night on the job. No urgency, no concern. In his mind, it was over the moment the cuffs locked around her wrists. He was used to absolute power. He was used to the people he arrested staying silent, keeping their heads down, accepting their fate. But he didn't realize this time, he wasn't dealing with just anyone. Danielle blinked slowly, keeping her breathing steady, but every muscle in her face was taut with anger. This injustice wasn't new to her. She had seen it, fought against it, read its details in 100 case files. But this time, it wasn't ink on a legal document. It wasn't just another deposition. This time it was happening to her. She lifted her head, her voice breaking through the heavy silence of the car, not loud, but sharp enough to slice through the air. "Are you sure about what you're doing?" Tyler raised an eyebrow. He didn't turn his head right away, but in the rearview mirror, Danielle saw the smirk tug at the corner of his lips. A short, cold laugh slipped from his throat, mocking, dismissive. "You don't get to ask questions." His voice was laced with the smug satisfaction of someone who believed he had complete control. He glanced at her through the mirror, his gaze impassive, like she was nothing more than another face, another booking, another number in his long list of forgettable arrests. But Danielle was not a name he would forget. She leaned forward slightly, the fire in her eyes shifting from anger to something else, something more dangerous. A silent warning. When she spoke again, her voice was steady, every syllable crisp, carrying the weight of someone who was used to commanding a courtroom. "I suggest you check my name. Right now." It wasn't a request. It wasn't a plea. It was a command. Tyler inhaled sharply through his teeth, finally turning his head this time, irritation flashing across his face. He hated being challenged. He had assumed he had crushed any resistance the moment he snapped the cuffs around her wrists. But no. Danielle wasn't cowering. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't afraid. Tyler blinked, then scoffed, shaking his head like he was indulging a meaningless joke. "You think I care who you are?" He let out a scoff, his voice dripping with condescension. "It doesn't matter. Whoever you are, you're just another arrest. In here, you don't have any rights." He turned back toward the road, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter, convinced the conversation was over, that his words had ended whatever hope she had of control. But he didn't know he had just made a critical mistake. He still didn't know who he was dealing with. He still didn't realize that the woman sitting in the backseat of his car was not someone easily silenced, not someone who would disappear into the system without a fight. He didn't know that with just one phone call, his entire world was about to come crashing down. The police car door swung open with a sharp, thunderous bang. A rush of cold air swept into the cabin, but the oppressive weight of the confined space still lingered. Tyler stood outside, his hand resting instinctively on the holster at his hip, a subconscious display of authority. He tilted his head slightly, peering into the car with a look of satisfaction as he took in the sight of Danielle still seated there, wrists bound tightly behind her back, the glow of the streetlights casting sharp contrasts of light and shadow across her face. "Get out!" His voice was curt, impatient. A command, not a request. Danielle didn't move immediately. She inhaled deeply, as if reclaiming her composure, before slowly shifting her body. With her movements restricted, she steadied herself as best as she could, stepping out of the vehicle with a deliberate, measured grace. Her back remained straight, her dark eyes calm, almost unsettlingly so. And Tyler hated that. He wanted to see fear. He wanted to see her shrink, to lower her head, to submit. But instead, she carried herself with defiance, moving with a quiet, unshaken dignity, even with her wrists bound behind her. Irritated, Tyler grabbed her arm roughly, shoving her forward toward the entrance of the police station. The glass doors slid open as they stepped inside. The air was thick with the stale scent of old coffee and worn paperwork, accompanied by the rhythmic clatter of keyboards being tapped. A few officers glanced up briefly as Danielle entered, but none said a word. Tyler's grip remained firm on her arm, as if he thought she might somehow slip away if he loosened it. He led her to the intake desk, where a middle-aged officer sat behind a computer, his expression flat and uninterested. "Name?" the officer asked, barely glancing up from his screen. "Danielle Harper." Tyler answered, his tone completely casual, as if he had just apprehended another nobody. But the moment the name left his lips, the officer hesitated. His fingers, which had been typing steadily, faltered for just a brief second. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. His eyes darted up, taking a second longer look at Danielle. A brief moment of uncertainty. But then, just as quickly, he lowered his gaze and continued typing. Tyler didn't notice. He was too busy throwing his chin toward the holding area. "Book her. I'll finish the paperwork in a minute." The officer nodded, pushing back his chair to head toward the cells. Only then did Tyler finally release Danielle's arm, but not gently. He shoved her forward slightly, a final reminder of who was in control. Danielle didn't say a word, but she was memorizing everything. She knew exactly where she was. She knew exactly whose game this was. But what Tyler didn't know was that this game wasn't over. It had barely begun. Across the station, Tyler dropped himself into a stiff chair in front of a computer. He stretched his arms, exhaling with the satisfaction of a job well done, before cracking his fingers and beginning to type up the report. He knew exactly how to write it. He knew which words to use to make everything look official. He knew how to turn an innocent person into a non-compliant suspect. And now he was doing it with Danielle Harper. The suspect displayed aggressive behavior, refused to comply with lawful orders, showed signs of resistance, requiring the use of force to ensure safety, obstructed officers in the performance of their duties, displayed an uncooperative attitude. Every sentence was carefully crafted to frame the narrative in his favor. Not a single word mentioned the lack of probable cause for the stop. Not a single detail acknowledged that she had been handcuffed without legal justification. The entire report served only one purpose: to justify an unjustified arrest. Tyler skimmed over his work, smirking slightly at how seamless it looked. He hit save, then leaned back in his chair, stretching lazily. To him, this was just another night on the job. Another report, another arrest. Nothing out of the ordinary. But what he didn't know was that a storm was coming. What he didn't realize was that the woman he had tried to break wasn't someone he could easily silence. What he didn't see coming was that in just a few minutes, the report he had so carefully constructed would become the very evidence that would destroy him. The low hum of conversation, the rhythmic clatter of keyboards, and the occasional crackle of the police radio filled the quiet space of the station. Distant laughter from a few night shift officers punctuated the air, meaningless sounds blending with the stale scent of old coffee, aged paperwork, and the unmistakable stench of power that had lingered far too long within these walls. Danielle stood still, her hands still bound behind her back, yet there was nothing in her stance that suggested weakness or defeat. Her gaze swept across the room, scanning every face, every expression. She didn't miss a single detail. At the intake desk, the officer typing her information into the system suddenly hesitated, A flicker of uncertainty crossed his face, brief, almost imperceptible, but she noticed. His eyes remained fixed on the screen, his posture shifting slightly, as if to double-check what he had just read. His fingers, which had been moving swiftly across the keyboard, slowed just enough for it to be noticeable. 1 second. That was all it took. The officer quietly lifted his gaze to Danielle, saying nothing, but his expression said everything. He knew who she was. Danielle met his stare, unflinching. She had been waiting for this moment. He wasn't an idiot. He recognized the name Danielle Harper wasn't just another entry in the system. Maybe he had seen her on the news. Maybe he had read about her high-profile cases. Maybe he had even come across her name in internal memos related to federal investigations. He knew, but he didn't say a word. Why? Because at that moment, he was faced with a choice. Acknowledge what he knew and intervene, or stay silent and protect his own place in the system. The hesitation lasted no more than a second, but to Danielle, it was long enough. No one stepped forward to help her. No one dared to do the right thing. No one in this room wanted to be the one to stand against Tyler, but that didn't mean she would stay silent. Danielle shifted slightly, her hands still cuffed behind her back, but when she spoke, her voice was clear, steady, deliberate, unwavering. "I want to make a phone call." The room suddenly felt quieter. The officer at the desk hesitated again, his throat bobbing as he swallowed. He didn't know how to respond. By protocol, detainees were allowed one phone call. But this wasn't just any arrest. He glanced toward Tyler as if waiting for a directive. Tyler, still seated at his desk nearby, looked up, his irritation evident at the mere idea of someone hesitating over what should have been an automatic decision. "Is there a problem?" His voice was sharp, laced with impatience. The officer stood frozen for a moment, biting his lower lip, clearly torn between logic and fear. He shouldn't allow this call, but he also knew that denying it could have consequences, especially if this all came to light later. Tyler tilted his head, sensing the hesitation, and let out a quiet, mocking laugh. "Who's she going to call? A lawyer? The press? Let her. It won't change anything." He shrugged, turning back to his computer, continuing to type out his fabricated account of the arrest. "Give her the damn call. Let's see what she thinks she can do." The intake officer swallowed hard once more, then nodded like he had just made a decision that could cost him everything. Stepping forward, he unlatched one of Danielle's cuffs, his fingers tightening briefly around her wrist before finally releasing it. "Come with me," he muttered, his voice low, just loud enough for her to hear. Danielle glanced down at her newly freed wrist, then slowly lifted her gaze to meet his. There was no gratitude in her eyes, no pleading, only one thing: absolute certainty. She was about to change everything. She followed him toward the small room at the back of the station. In her mind, a number was already dialed. The small room behind the intake desk was cold and dimly lit, furnished with nothing but a scratched wooden table and an old landline phone placed neatly at the center. There were no windows, no cameras watching, but the air felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were swallowing every sound within. Danielle stood before the table, her wrist still aching from where the cuffs had dug into her skin. The officer who had escorted her inside said nothing. He cast one last glance at her before stepping out, closing the door behind him not harshly, but with quiet finality. Now it was just her and the phone. She took a deep breath, letting her gaze sweep over the aged plastic surface of the device. The numbers on the keypad were faded, worn from years of desperate calls made by detainees who had sat in this very room before her. But this was not going to be a desperate call. Danielle picked up the receiver, the familiar hum of the dial tone filling the silence. She didn't hesitate. She didn't second guess. Her fingers moved swiftly, pressing each number with precision, with certainty. Not a lawyer, not a colleague, not a family member. She was calling the United States Attorney General. The ringing echoed through the small room, stretching into long, steady intervals. Her heartbeat remained calm, unshaken. She knew without a doubt he would answer. And when he did, this game would never be the same again. Danielle only needs one call, just one, to turn the tables. But the real question is, will Tyler realize his mistake before it's too late? Or will he keep digging himself deeper into the hole he created? Don't blink, this battle for justice is far from over. The most jaw-dropping twists are still ahead. Hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a single shocking, heart-pounding moment. Thank you for standing with us in the fight for truth and justice. The cold plastic of the phone pressed against Danielle's palm, but her grip remained firm, unwavering. The ringing stretched out in steady intervals, echoing through the confined space of the holding room. She didn't blink, her gaze locked on the blank wall before her, the dim neon light overhead casting a pale glow over her face. She knew. 3 rings, just 3 seconds more, and everything would change. And right on cue, the line clicked open. "Harper, what the hell is going on?" The voice on the other end was deep, commanding no pleasantries, no hesitation. The name Danielle Harper was not unfamiliar within the highest echelons of the federal justice system, and the U.S. Attorney General did not receive calls like this unless something was seriously wrong. "I have been unlawfully detained by a local police officer. No charges, no legal grounds." Silence, not uncertainty, calculation. Danielle could picture the way the man on the other end was gripping the armrest of his chair, already assessing the weight of what she had just told him. When a chief federal prosecutor called the attorney general in the middle of the night, there was no such thing as a minor incident. His voice was lower now, colder, like steel tempered in fire. His name? Tyler? Location? County Police Station. There were no redundant questions, no disbelief, no requests for more details. The Attorney General knew. The second the name Danielle Harper appeared in an unjustified arrest report, this was no longer an issue confined to a single police precinct. The entire federal justice system was now in motion. Phones rang in rapid succession across Washington, D.C. In the federal prosecutor's office, an urgent call interrupted a high-level meeting. Within 30 seconds, an internal email was sent to the top legal advisors, their expressions darkening as they absorbed the contents. Within minutes, the director of the FBI was on the phone, his tone clipped, giving orders that set an entire bureau into action. And the calls kept coming, expanding outward in concentric ripples, spreading through the highest corridors of power like wildfire. When a federal prosecutor was illegally detained, it was no longer just a wrongful arrest, it was a national crisis. The front doors of the precinct swung open. Instantly, the atmosphere in the station shifted. Conversations halted. Officers who had been chatting fell into an uneasy silence, their expressions snapping from indifference to uncertainty. Because the men and women walking in through those doors weren't their superiors. They were the people who could end their careers with a single stroke of a pen. Crisp suits, gold-embossed badges glinting under fluorescent lights. Footsteps measured, deliberate, filled with the kind of authority that left no room for doubt. Leading the charge were senior federal attorneys from the Department of Justice. Close behind them, FBI agents' expressions unreadable, but radiating controlled intensity. No one spoke. No one had to. This wasn't an internal review. This wasn't an oversight meeting. This was a federal intervention. At his desk, Tyler was still typing, adding the final touches to his fabricated report. His fingers moved fast, each keystroke embedding words he had used 100 times before. The suspect refused to comply, exhibited signs of aggression, obstructed law enforcement in the course of duty, language designed to shield him, phrases engineered to turn an innocent person into a hostile offender. But this time, it wouldn't work. Because as the heavy footsteps reached the precinct floor, as the sheer weight of authority flooded into the room, Tyler felt the shift before he even saw it. A cold prickle ran down his spine. Instinctively, he looked up, and what he saw, his heart slammed against his ribs. Federal attorneys, FBI agents, high-ranking officials from the Department of Justice, and, worst of all, standing in the center of the room, eyes locked onto him with an expression of lethal calm. The U.S. Attorney General himself. Tyler's blood ran cold. His fingers twitched above the keyboard. This wasn't possible. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. His throat went dry. He flicked his gaze around the room, searching for backup, for any officer who might throw him a lifeline. But the other cops were frozen in place. their faces paling as realization dawned. None of them knew what was happening, but Tyler knew. This wasn't a routine arrest. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was the beginning of the worst nightmare of his life. The grand courtroom was heavy with silence. The bright overhead lights cast sharp reflections on the polished wooden tables, but no one paid attention to the light. Every eye in the room was fixed on a single moment, one that would determine the fate of a man who had once thought himself untouchable. At the defendant's table, Tyler sat frozen. His hands were clenched into fists, his knuckles white from tension. He tried to steady his breathing, to maintain the illusion of confidence, but the beads of sweat forming on his forehead betrayed him. He didn't want to look around. He didn't want to meet the gazes of those who now saw him for what he truly was. But he couldn't escape the truth that was closing in on him. Across from him, Danielle Harper stood tall, her presence commanding. She was no longer the woman dragged out of her car in humiliation. She was no longer the detainee thrown into a holding cell without cause. She was no longer the accused. Today, she was the prosecutor, and she was here to bring justice upon the man who had abused his power. On the judge's bench, the presiding judge sat upright, his eyes methodically scanning the case file before him. Page after page flipped in silence, his expression shifting ever so slightly. At first, focused concentration, then a flicker of hesitation, and finally the weight of absolute gravity settling over his face. The tension in the courtroom grew thick, suffocating. The ticking of the clock on the wall became unbearably loud, the only sound in a room filled with held breaths. Then the judge's voice broke through the silence. Not fast, not slow, but deliberate. "Do you have any idea who you arrested?" Tyler's brow furrowed. He forced himself to maintain his composure, scoffing slightly as if trying to downplay the moment. "A suspect who resisted arrest. Someone who obstructed law enforcement." His voice carried an edge of forced nonchalance, as if the entire situation was just another routine case. He was used to controlling the narrative. He was used to holding all the power. He was used to winning. But this time, he had miscalculated. The judge slammed the case file shut with a loud thud, the sound reverberating across the courtroom. He lifted his gaze, eyes burning with sharp intensity as they bore into Tyler. His voice, when it came, was unforgiving. "Did you truly not know, or did you choose to ignore it?" Tyler stiffened. His confidence wavered for the first time. He flicked his eyes around the courtroom, searching for someone, anyone to back him up. But no one moved. No one spoke. And then the judge leaned forward, tapping his index finger against the desk for emphasis, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "This is Danielle Harper, Chief Federal Prosecutor of the United States." A shockwave rippled through the room. Everything stopped. Not a breath, not a whisper, not a single movement. The spectators gaped in the stunned disbelief. Expressions shifted from curiosity to outright shock. Some blinked repeatedly, as if unable to process what they had just heard. In the back rows, journalists scrambled over their keyboards, fingers flying across screens, knowing they were witnessing the headline of the year. At the prosecutor's table, the team of federal attorneys exchanged glances. They didn't need to say a word. They knew. This wasn't just another case. This was a case that would shake the system to its core. At the defense table, Tyler sat paralyzed. His face had drained of all color. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. Chill ran down his spine, his muscles locking up. His gaze darted to Danielle, but she remained as she had always been, unshaken, composed, powerful. And at that moment, it all clicked. The name Danielle Harper struck him like a lightning bolt. He had arrested one of the most powerful figures in the U.S. legal system. He had fabricated charges against a federal prosecutor. He had unknowingly ignited the biggest scandal of his career. And worse, he knew. There was no way out of this. His game was over. You won't believe what's coming next. Hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single second of this shocking, high-stakes drama. The revelation in the courtroom was only the beginning. Within hours, the Department of Justice and the FBI launched a full-scale emergency investigation, not just into Tyler, but also into his commanding officer, Sergeant Paul Hastings. The case had escalated far beyond a wrongful arrest. It had become a matter of national concern, triggering an immediate federal response. The first step of the investigation was to dig into Officer Tyler's disciplinary history, an inquiry that quickly unearthed a deeply disturbing pattern of abuse and cover-ups spanning years. Federal agents combed through internal police records, cross-referencing them with citizen complaints, body camera footage, and incident reports. What they found was far worse than expected. Tyler had a long, unchecked history of misconduct, excessive force, racial profiling, falsified reports, and unlawful arrests. His name appeared in dozens of citizen complaints, yet not a single one had ever resulted in disciplinary action. Documents revealed that Tyler had been accused of brutalizing civilians, detaining people without cause, and fabricating charges, yet every single complaint had either been dismissed or buried. His pattern of targeting Black and Latino individuals was especially alarming, showing a clear racial bias in his enforcement tactics. But the most damning discovery wasn't just Tyler's actions. It was the system that had allowed him to operate without consequence for years. Every complaint filed against Tyler had been processed, reviewed, and dismissed under the authority of Sergeant Paul Hastings. Hastings had personally signed off on multiple reports declaring accusations against Tyler unsubstantiated, even when eyewitness testimony and medical reports suggested otherwise. In several cases, video evidence of misconduct had mysteriously disappeared, and witnesses who had come forward had later recanted their statements under suspicious circumstances. Federal investigators quickly realized that this was no coincidence. This was a deliberate operation designed to protect officers like Tyler from accountability. Hastings had created a shield of impunity, ensuring that his most aggressive officers faced no real consequences for their actions. He had orchestrated a system of cover-ups where any civilian who dared to file a complaint was either ignored, intimidated, or had their claims dismissed as lacking evidence. But now that system was unraveling. With every new file unearthed, the FBI built a stronger case against not just Tyler and Hastings, but the entire chain of command that had enabled them. Internal memos surfaced showing communications between Hastings and other high-ranking officers, where they had discussed how to handle misconduct complaints to avoid public scrutiny. Officers who had worked under Hastings were now being brought in for questioning, some of whom were already cooperating in exchange for lesser charges. The investigation also revealed financial irregularities. Hastings and several officers under his command had received suspicious cash deposits, bonuses, and off-the-books payments that did not align with their official salaries. Further inquiry led to the discovery of bribery schemes involving local businesses and private security firms, exposing a broader network of corruption that extended far beyond a single police precinct. For years, Hastings had controlled who got promoted, who got protected, and who got punished, using his position to silence anyone who challenged his authority. But now he was no longer the one in control. Tyler, who had once walked into the police station with arrogance, now sat in an interrogation room, his face pale as he was forced to watch the mountain of evidence stacked against him. Every falsified report, every dismissed complaint, every body cam footage that had been conveniently lost was now part of the federal case being built against him. What had started as a single wrongful arrest had escalated into a full-blown federal corruption probe, threatening to bring down the entire department. Tyler was no longer just a rogue officer under investigation. He was the catalyst for exposing one of the largest police corruption scandals in recent history. And Hastings? He was no longer just a commanding officer overseeing a precinct. He was now the prime suspect in a federal corruption case that could end careers, dismantle an entire police force, and change the system forever. For the first time in his career, Tyler could no longer rely on his badge to protect him. The same system that had shielded him for years was now turning against him, and no amount of falsified reports or intimidation tactics would be able to stop what was coming next. The scandal had already erupted within law enforcement and the judicial system, but Danielle Harper knew that exposing the corruption within police ranks wasn't enough. This needed to be bigger. This needed to reach the people. She refused to let the case be buried under bureaucratic red tape. She refused to allow the system to quietly remove Tyler and Hastings, only to replace them with others just like them. This wasn't just about punishing a few bad cops. This was about forcing a reckoning, about dragging an entire culture of impunity into the light. Within days, she pushed the case into the public sphere. She made sure the press got every detail: the wrongful arrest, the falsified reports, the systemic cover-ups, and the network of corruption embedded deep within law enforcement. She worked with journalists, civil rights organizations, and legal advocacy groups to ensure that the story dominated headlines nationwide. And it worked. The public erupted. News outlets ran non-stop coverage, dissecting every aspect of the case. Social media exploded with discussions, calls for justice, and nationwide outrage. Prominent activists and legal experts weighed in, denouncing the blatant abuse of power and the need for immediate reform. Protests erupted in major cities, with demonstrators demanding accountability not just for Tyler and Hastings, but for the entire justice system that had enabled them. As public pressure mounted, Congress had no choice but to respond. A formal public hearing was scheduled before the United States Congress, to be broadcast live across the nation. This was no longer just an internal police investigation. This was now a national crisis. The grand hearing chamber was packed. Every seat in the gallery was filled with journalists, activists, legal scholars, and citizens who had traveled from across the country to witness what was about to unfold. Cameras were stationed at every angle, broadcasting the event to millions of viewers across the nation. At the front of the chamber, seated behind a polished mahogany desk with a microphone in front of her, Danielle Harper sat poised and unshaken. She was no longer just a prosecutor. She was a symbol of what happens when the system fails to hold itself accountable, a symbol of why no one is safe when those in power believe they are untouchable. Congressional representatives sat before her, their faces grave, their voices measured as they opened the hearing with formal proceedings. One after another, they read out the damning findings of the federal investigation. Over 50 complaints of misconduct against Officer Tyler, every single one buried. Surveillance footage deliberately deleted, evidence tampered with. A network of officers under Hastings trained to falsify reports and intimidate victims. A precinct where corruption wasn't an accident, it was policy. The facts were staggering, but facts alone weren't enough. Danielle knew that what would truly ignite change wasn't just data, it was emotion. It was the undeniable truth that what had happened to her wasn't unique. So when her turn to speak came, she leaned forward slightly, her voice clear and unwavering as she uttered the words that would be replayed on television screens for weeks to come. If this could happen to me, it can happen to anyone. The room fell into absolute silence. The weight of that statement settled on the chamber like a heavy fog. The politicians seated before her, many of whom had spent their careers defending the status quo, shifted in their chairs. Some cleared their throats. Others avoided her gaze. Because they knew she was right. She wasn't just a regular citizen. She was one of the most powerful prosecutors in the country, a woman who had dedicated her career to upholding the law, only to have the very system she fought for turn against her in an instant. If even she could be dragged out of her car, handcuffed, humiliated, and thrown into a jail cell with no cause, what chance did the average person have? If a chief federal prosecutor could be falsely arrested, framed, and nearly silenced, then what happened to those without power, without influence, without resources? That question didn't just linger in the room. It resonated across the nation. The walls had closed in. The men who once wielded their power with arrogance, who had acted with impunity, who had laughed in the face of justice, now sat before it, completely powerless. The federal investigation had been swift, thorough, and merciless. Every thread pulled unraveled more of the deep-seated corruption that had enabled Tyler and Hastings for years. What had once been buried complaints were now front-page news. What had once been ignored victims were now standing at the witness stand, their voices unshakable. Tyler and Hastings had spent years manipulating the system, but the weight of their crimes was now bearing down on them with full force. And this time, there was no escaping the consequences. Tyler sat in the defendant's chair, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The once proud officer, who had strutted around his precinct with unchecked authority, was now reduced to a man watching his own destruction unfold in real time. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. First, they laid out his long history of misconduct, presenting a damning pattern of abuse, falsification of reports, and racial profiling. Next came the victims, men and women who had once been too afraid to speak, who had been ignored by internal affairs, who had been threatened into silence. Now they stood before the court, recounting the horrors they had endured at his hands. One by one, they told their stories. A black father falsely accused of resisting arrest and beaten so severely by Tyler that he spent 2 weeks in the hospital. A teenage boy harassed and detained without cause, left traumatized after spending a night in a jail cell for a crime he never committed. A Latina mother dragged from her car and handcuffed in front of her children because Tyler claimed she was acting suspiciously. Every testimony stripped away the last shreds of credibility he had left. Then came the evidence. Recovered body camera footage showed brutal encounters Tyler had denied ever happened. His voice could be heard, laced with malice, as he taunted, threatened, and fabricated reasons for his actions. Internal reports proved how he had lied over and over again, twisting the truth to justify his abuses. The final blow came when his fellow officers, some of whom had once protected him, began testifying against him, offering details of how he had bragged about getting away with everything, how he had laughed about teaching people a lesson with his badge and gun. By the time the prosecution rested its case, there was nothing left to defend. When the jury was sent to deliberate, it took them less than 3 hours to return with their decision. The courtroom was silent as the judge handed down the sentence. 25 years in federal prison for abuse of power, falsification of evidence, and civil rights violations. Tyler did not react. Not when the cuffs clicked around his wrists. Not when the officers led him away from the courtroom. Not even when he heard the reporters outside announcing his downfall to the world. It was over. For the first time in his life, he had to face consequences. If Tyler's trial had been a reckoning, Hastings was a complete dismantling of everything he had built. The man who had once controlled an entire precinct with an iron grip, who had manipulated the system to protect his officers, who had buried complaints, tampered with evidence, and silenced victims with a single stroke of his pen, now found himself at the center of a federal corruption probe. Unlike Tyler, Hastings had never been on the front lines of brutality. His crimes weren't about what he did with his hands, but rather what he orchestrated from the shadows. The prosecution laid out the case piece by piece, exposing how he had blocked internal investigations into Tyler and other officers under his command, destroyed evidence that would have implicated his officers in excessive force complaints, coerced witnesses into recanting their statements through intimidation tactics, received illicit payments and kickbacks from private security firms and local businesses in exchange for special protections. What had once been rumors was now an airtight case built on undeniable evidence: emails, financial records, witness testimonies. Every single document, every single transaction painted a picture of a man who had run his precinct like a criminal enterprise. When the verdict came down, it was just as swift and just as devastating. 30 years in federal prison. The moment the gavel struck, Hastings finally understood what it meant to be powerless. For the first time, he had no authority, no leverage, no control. All he had left was the reality that the system he had corrupted had finally turned on him. As Tyler and Hastings were led away in handcuffs, the world watched, processed, and reacted. For years, their victims had been ignored. For years, the system had protected them. And now the same system had held them accountable. But for Danielle Harper, this was never just about two men. This was about the culture that had allowed them to thrive, the unchecked power that had turned law enforcement into an institution that served itself rather than the people. Their convictions were a victory, but the fight was far from over. As she stepped outside the courthouse, facing the swarm of cameras, reporters, and activists waiting for a statement, she knew the real question wasn't just about Tyler or Hastings anymore. The real question was, who would be next? Justice had been served in the courtroom, but Danielle Harper knew that true justice extended far beyond the convictions of two corrupt officers. Tyler and Hastings were not anomalies. They were the inevitable products of a system that had allowed unchecked power to fester for decades. Their downfall was a victory, but it was not the end of the battle. If nothing changed, it would happen again. Danielle had spent her career fighting for accountability, but this time, she wasn't just fighting for one case, one victim, or one moment of justice. She was fighting for permanent systemic change. The public demanded action. The system had no choice but to respond. What followed was not just another round of superficial police reform discussions, not another set of vague promises that would quietly fade away as soon as public outrage died down. This time, change was forced into existence. This time, the system itself was about to be fundamentally restructured. One of the most immediate and groundbreaking reforms was the creation of the Independent Police Oversight Commission, a federally funded body designed to investigate police misconduct without interference from law enforcement agencies. For decades, police departments had been allowed to police themselves, leading to a culture of cover-ups, corruption, and a blatant disregard for accountability. Internal affairs departments had functioned as little more than rubber stamps, dismissing complaints, shielding bad officers, and ensuring that misconduct never saw the light of day. That system was now dismantled. The newly established Independent Police Oversight Commission operated entirely outside of the influence of local police departments, city governments, or police unions. It had broad federal authority to conduct independent investigations, issue subpoenas, and enforce disciplinary actions against officers who abused their power. This wasn't just a review board, this was a law enforcement watchdog with real teeth. Every complaint against an officer, no matter how minor, was automatically forwarded to the Commission for Independent Review. If an officer was accused of misconduct, the case could no longer be handled internally, it had to be investigated by federal agents, with full transparency. Any officer found guilty of misconduct would face immediate consequences, from mandatory retraining to termination, and in severe cases, federal prosecution. One of the Commission's most significant powers was its ability to recommend criminal charges against officers who engaged in misconduct. For too long, prosecutors had been hesitant to charge police officers, fearing backlash from law enforcement agencies. Now the decision was out of their hands. If the Oversight Commission determined that an officer had violated the law, the case was automatically referred to the Department of Justice for prosecution, no loopholes, no exceptions. And for the first time in U.S. history, police departments were no longer in control of their own accountability. The message was clear. The days of officers abusing their power with impunity were over. One of the most shocking discoveries during the investigation into Tyler and Hastings was how officers with long histories of misconduct were able to resign quietly and get rehired at other departments, continuing their abuse elsewhere. The problem was simple. There was no national tracking system for bad officers. This loophole had allowed police departments to fire officers for misconduct, only for them to move to another city, another precinct, another state, and start all over again with a clean record. That loophole was now closed. A national police misconduct database was created, a permanent registry of all officers who had been disciplined, fired, or had credible complaints against them. This database was made available to every police department in the country, ensuring that officers who engaged in misconduct could never simply transfer to another department and continue their abuses elsewhere. Any department that knowingly hired an officer with a history of misconduct would lose federal funding and face legal consequences. No more second chances for bad cops. If an officer was deemed unfit to serve, they would never wear a badge again. For years, police officers had been shielded from lawsuits by a legal doctrine known as qualified immunity, which prevented citizens from suing officers for misconduct unless they could prove that their rights had been violated in a way that had already been explicitly ruled unconstitutional in previous cases. This absurd legal standard had created a near impossible burden of proof, making it almost impossible for victims to hold officers financially accountable for their actions. That shield was now removed. Under the new reforms, officers could now be sued personally for their misconduct, meaning that victims of police brutality could take them to court and hold them financially liable for the harm they caused. If an officer assaulted a civilian without cause, they could no longer hide behind their badge. They could be sued just like any other citizen. If an officer falsified a police report, planted evidence, or wrongfully detained someone, they could now be held accountable in civil court. For the first time, officers were made to understand that their actions had personal consequences, not just for their department, but for them as individuals. The days of unquestioned police protection under the law were officially over. The case against Tyler and Hastings had proven beyond doubt that some police departments had operated as lawless entities, engaging in widespread abuse and corruption with no oversight, no accountability, and no fear of consequences. To prevent this from happening again, the government implemented mandatory federal oversight for police departments with a history of excessive force complaints, civil rights violations, or patterns of misconduct. Precincts with repeated complaints were placed under direct federal monitoring, with external oversight committees reviewing all officer conduct. Departments with a track record of corruption were given two choices: undergo reform or be dismantled entirely. Whistleblower protections were strengthened, ensuring that officers who reported misconduct would be protected rather than punished. For the first time in history, corrupt police departments were no longer left to govern themselves. If a department was found to be engaging in misconduct, it would be restructured from the top down, with entire leadership teams being removed and replaced with federal appointees committed to enforcing justice, not shielding abusers. These weren't just minor policy changes. These were massive, structural transformations, rewriting the rules of policing in America. For decades, officers like Tyler and supervisors like Hastings had operated without fear, knowing that their departments, their unions, and the legal system would always protect them. But now, the system had changed. The law was no longer on their side. And for the first time in history, the American people, not the police, had the final say in how law enforcement would function. Danielle Harper had set out to win justice for herself, but in the end, she had won something even bigger. She had forced an entire system to change. The air outside the courthouse carried a quiet stillness, a stark contrast to the storm of events that had unfolded over the past few months. The golden hues of the setting sun painted long shadows across the concrete steps, the sky above transitioning from deep blue to the soft orange of twilight. The press had finally started to clear out, their cameras and microphones no longer pointed at Danielle Harper's every move. Protesters who had once flooded these steps, demanding justice, had begun to dissipate, some talking in hushed voices, others standing in small groups, still absorbing what had transpired. For Danielle, this was a moment that should have felt like closure. But justice was never about a single victory. She stood near the courthouse entrance, her arms crossed loosely over her chest, exhaustion settling into her bones, not from defeat, but from the sheer weight of the battle that had just been won. Fight had been long, brutal, and at times seemed impossible. But here she was. Here they all were. And the world was different now. Yet she knew there were still wounds left unhealed. As she exhaled, ready to take in the moment before her, she heard soft but deliberate footsteps approaching from behind. The quiet determination in those steps made her turn. A woman stood there, hesitating just a few feet away. She was young, maybe early 30s, but her eyes held the weight of someone who had lived through things that had aged her far beyond her years. She was dressed in a simple blouse and jeans. Nothing remarkable, but there was something about the way she carried herself, shoulders slightly hunched, as if she had spent years trying to make herself smaller, unseen. Danielle recognized that look. It was the same look she had seen in courtrooms, in waiting rooms, in police stations, the look of someone who had been told over and over again that her voice didn't matter, that her pain didn't count, that justice wasn't meant for her. Their eyes met, and the woman took a shaky breath before speaking. "I don't want to take up too much of your time," she started, her voice soft but steady. "But I needed to say this to you in person." Danielle turned fully to face her, sensing that whatever this woman had to say, it mattered. She gave a small nod, silently encouraging her to continue. The woman swallowed as if trying to push down years of hurt, years of silence. "I was one of them," she finally said. "One of the people he hurt." She didn't say his name, but she didn't need to. Danielle knew. A sharp pang hit her chest. She had read the case files, had seen the names, the stories, the faces of so many people who had suffered because of him. Some of them had been too afraid to come forward. Others had come forward only to be ignored, dismissed, threatened into silence. The woman took another deep breath, her fingers gripping the strap of her purse as if holding on for stability. "I filed a complaint years ago," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I thought maybe someone would listen, but no one ever did." Danielle's stomach tightened. She had spent her career fighting against the very system that had failed this woman. She had spent sleepless nights poring over reports, watching the same pattern repeat itself. People who should have been heard were ignored. People who should have been protected were harmed. People who should have received justice were denied it at every turn. And yet, here this woman was standing in front of her, still strong, still here. "For a long time, I stopped believing in justice," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "I thought people like him would always win, that people like me would always lose." She let out a quiet, shaky exhale, as if she had been holding those words in for too long. Then she lifted her gaze and met Danielle's eyes with something different, something that hadn't been there before. "Hope. But you changed that," she said, her voice steadier now. "You made me believe in justice again." Danielle felt the words hit her harder than she expected. She had won cases before. She had stood in courtrooms and heard verdicts delivered. She had seen guilty men led away in handcuffs. But none of those moments had felt as heavy, as real as this one. This wasn't about one conviction. This wasn't about one courtroom victory. This was about the people who had been told that justice wasn't for them, finally seeing that it could be. Danielle blinked, swallowing against the tightness in her throat. She had spent her career standing in front of podiums, speaking to judges, debating with politicians, but this was what it was all for. She inhaled, letting the weight of the moment settle before she spoke. "Justice only exists if we demand it," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "If we refuse to be silent, if we refuse to let them win." The woman nodded, her eyes glistening. But this time, it wasn't from despair. It was something else, something stronger. Danielle reached out and placed a hand on the woman's shoulder, steady and sure. "You were never invisible," she continued. "They just didn't want to see you. But now they have no choice." A tear slipped down the woman's cheek, but this time, it wasn't a tear of defeat. It was a tear of something new. Strength, resolve, hope. Danielle gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze before stepping back. The woman exhaled, as if something deep inside her had finally been lifted. She didn't say anything else she didn't need to. Instead, she gave a small nod of gratitude before turning and walking away, blending into the city around her. Danielle watched her go, knowing that this wasn't just one woman's story. This was hundreds of voices that had been silenced. This was thousands of people who had been ignored. And now they were finally being heard. She looked back up at the sky, the last remnants of daylight slipping beneath the horizon. The fight wasn't over. It would never be over. But tonight, justice had won. For the first time in a long time, she truly believed that it would keep winning.